Presidents, fellows and guests, it's a great pleasure to be here, and there could be few more appropriate places to be thinking about the history of libraries in British houses than the Society of Antiquaries. Those of us who were not enjoying our tea and cake earlier on could, if we wished, take a moment to snoop on the portrait by Thomas Hill of our co-founder, Humphrey Wanley, which hangs at the bottom of the stairs to our own library. Now, Wanley is a figure who will be well known to many of us, and of course spent a large proportion of his time either just round the corner in the town library of his patron saint of Oxford in Dover Street, or here in the great James Gibbs Library at Wimpole, which, a little bit of a simplification, which essentially housed the Harley's collections of printed books, which are described in great detail in an enormous 14-volume folio catalogue, which is today with the other Harley manuscripts in the British Library. I should perhaps start by offering, maybe not an apology, but certainly an explanation that a high proportion of what you're going to see this evening is indeed drawn from the portfolio of libraries which I deal with for my august employer, the National Trust. Not because I in any sense imply lack of interest in elsewhere, but really for two reasons. First, because the Trust portfolio of libraries is so enormous that it's possible to cover many of the issues that I want to deal with, dealing with the collections which I know best and for which I have a day-to-day responsibility. And the second is because I'm fortunate enough to have access to a very splendid image library, which means I can show you nice pictures of things rather than rather second-rate bits and pieces snapped on my iPhone. So I hope that will be some useful explanation. What I'm thinking about this evening is less work in progress, but really perhaps rather more thought in progress. Because as our President was saying, one of the most pleasing aspects of the study of private libraries, and indeed the study of libraries in country houses in particular, in recent years, has been an enormous proliferation of case studies. And this is extraordinarily welcome. I remember when I was shortlisted by our former president, I believe, for the post of curator of libraries at the National Trust some 13 years ago, I did what any well-trained librarian would do, which is to often do a literature search to see what had been published on country house libraries. And the answer, I'm sorry to say, was precious little. That reading list would be considerably longer today than it was then. But what I'm trying to do is perhaps try and muse in the direction of having a bit more of an overview, a structure, a way of thinking about these collections, and perhaps going with one or two contentions, which I hope will not be assertions on my part, but much more an attempt to provoke a debate and ask, are we on the right lines here? Where do we start? We're being very daring, we could even start in Rome and Britain. And those of you who read Marshall, either at school or university, will remember he says, my books are so popular that even reading them in Britain. Now, whether they really were reading them in Roman villas is a matter for debate. Of course, we know about the Vindolanda tablets, the military establishment, of course, Vindolanda. So literacy perhaps rather more well established than once might have been assumed. And of course the iconography of mosaics here and there goes some way towards suggesting that the sort of villas with their libraries, with their scrolls in, described by Pliny the Younger and discovered at Herculaneum in the 1750s, may not have been wholly without their equivalents on this side of the Saxon shore. However, it's perhaps a little bit more sensible that we move to the Middle Ages. And those of you who don't know Petworth will immediately think, why does this clown put up a picture of a great Baroque palace to talk about the Middle Ages? Those who do know Petworth in Sussex, which I guess is probably most fellows here today, will immediately remember that this great Baroque palace is in fact wrapped around a medieval manor house, the southern pad of the Purcells, Earls and later Dukes of Northumberland. So we have a medieval chapel. For those of an antiquarian bent, we have sundry medieval treasures knocking around the house, like this rather splendid fellow. But among the greatest of the Petworth treasures, and indeed one of the most marvellous things in the house, and indeed in modern times, we said one of the most overlooked things in the house, is this, which is the Petworth Chaucer manuscript, which we've recently digitised in collaboration with the John Rylands Library in Manchester. You can browse the whole thing on the web if you're so minded. You'll be able to see it on site, redisplayed fairly soon. Now, this manuscript is not a rather flash collectible bought by a 19th century antiquarian bibliophile, but a manuscript which has been in the hands of the Purcell family and passed by descent since at least the late 15th century. And that seems to me to be rather interesting. And it is a reminder if you like, that there are sundry manuscripts knocking around, which if you choose to look at them like this, and I think perhaps I do, we can helpfully regard as part of the prehistory of what went on to become country house libraries. These manuscripts, of course, tend to fall into two categories. They're books for reading, and of course, they are liturgical books, books which may have been kept in specific locations, in chapels, or in specific houses, but equally books that may well have moved around with their owners. It is an intriguing observation too, drawn to my attention by Father Geoffrey Scott, the Abbot of Dowie at a conference on Saturday, that when one does find medieval manuscripts which are passed by descent in British country houses, as often as not, there's a Catholic connection somewhere. So this is Coton Court in Warwickshire, where there are still in situ 7 medieval manuscripts, which as far as anyone can make out, have passed by descent since the 14th and 15th centuries. There are 2 more manuscripts from the Throckmorton collection, if I can call it that, which is strayed, one of which is the Buckland Missal in Bodley, and the other is at London Platts Library. There are other examples which one can pull out if one was so minded. For example, the book of hours of Lady Eleanor Percy at Paris Castle in mid-Wales, well, firmly Protestant today, but firmly Catholic well into the 17th century, and other examples too. Now, of course, a set of liturgical books was an essential part of the kit of any great medieval household, and we know from published inventories that there were, for example, complete sets of liturgical books here in the Chapel of the Vine in Hampshire in the reign of Henry VIII. None survive today. What I can point to, however, is one of our more remarkable library acquisitions of the last decade, which is the unique copy of the 1487 Caxton Sarum Wright Missal from Lyme Park in Cheshire, a point that we were most keen to make to potential, let us say, grant-giving bodies, was once again this manuscript of Lyme Park was not some frippery assembled by a mid-Victorian collector, which would mean as much in any other library as it did in Cheshire, but a manuscript which appeared to have, a printed book, which appeared to have passed by descent since the day it was printed, or not very long after. In fact, rather interestingly, this manuscript, and this is a pattern which I think is replicated elsewhere, this missal was almost certainly in the Lee family chantry at Disley Church, and was clearly quietly retrenched back into the house when Catholic liturgical books were no longer required in a parish church. It has within it all of the physical evidence that one would like to see of the progress of the Reformation in mid-Tudor England. And I won't go through all the glossings and the notes, but among other things, there are English glosses of the vows, the Latin vows and the marriage service, to enable a priest to explain the nature of the contract to the happy couple. Seems appropriate today to mention that. And then we have the Oratio pro Papa, which of course has been very carefully crossed out. One might know the Lee family clearly ongoing in their Catholic sympathies. Whoever defaced the book for them did it carefully enough to be seen to obeying the injunction, but not so carefully that you couldn't still read the prayer if you were minded to do so. And also, in the margin of this wonderful printed book, a curse. Richard Moody I beshrew with my whole heart and a piece of my stomach. Richard Moody being the local hot Protestant, the rector of Standish in the reign of Edward VI and Queen Mary. We see continuity of another kind in another species of country house. These, of course, are the monastic cloisters at Laycock in Wiltshire, a rather grand Augustinian nunnery, where a significant part of medieval fabric, though not the church, survived the depredations of William Sharrington, the wicked courtier and member of the household of Henry VIII, who took over the place as a private residence. Among other things, he took over sundry bits and pieces from the era of the nuns, including an enormous bronze cauldron, copy of the Magna Carta, the Henry III Magna Carta, sadly no longer present on site, and also this, which was reckoned by Neil Carr to be the only English monastic manuscript which one could prove beyond any doubt had stayed on site, other than obviously in cathedral libraries like Durham and Worcester, had stayed on site and remained there into modern times. And this too, I'm delighted to say, has been one of the more major National Trust library acquisitions of recent years. A manuscript made in about 1400, a directory of difficult words in the Vulgate by a little-known commentator, William Brito, otherwise Guillaume Le Breton. Fascinating because its binding and its binding fragments show beyond any doubt that this book was actually bound at Laycock. But this, if you like, is a bit of a prehistory and a preface to what I want to talk about now, which is the three-storey tower at Laycock, built on one corner of the Wallace Church by Sharrington, one of Henry VIII's courtiers. It has, as you can see, and many people know this building, 3 stories. The bottom, I fear to say now, is rather empty and functions as a sort of rather glorified garden shed. The top chamber is a banqueting chamber, but the middle one is a strong room or study or studiolo. Of course, all the attention it's attracted historically has been in the direction of the wonderful Chapman table, obviously very much inspired by sort of Fontainebleau-ish sort of French Renaissance models. But I think for me, as someone interested in books and related matters, more interesting as to what this room is or what it was. And I think the strong suspicion is this room is a closet or strong room or study in which something that was valuable, note the armoured door, was kept. Now, no fittings and furniture here today, but one could just easily imagine wooden fittings and furnishings or some form of lining for those alcoves. This is speculation, but I think it's not unintelligent speculation because we know from documentary sources that books in Tudor and Jacobean England were kept in rooms which sources tend to refer to sometimes as libraries, sometimes as closets, and sometimes as studies. And it's very clear, and I won't go into the details of this now, it's very clear that many people use those terms interchangeably without having a much clearer idea what's the difference between these things, if there is any. I'll show you another example, my supposition, and rather later. This is the mid-17th century, late 17th century cedar closet at Tredegar in South Wales, which has been shown to paying punters for the last 40-odd years as a sort of cabinet of curiosities. It's a small wooden-lined room with 3 decks of cupboards with shelves within them. If you look closely at the glass, which have the shelves and the other cabinet of curiosities type displays in them, it's pretty obvious that those glazed doors have been put in very, very much later than the room, probably in the 19th century. I can't prove this beyond any doubt, but again, the presence of armour plating over the windows and reading between the lines in ancient 19th century documents, it looks to me as if this room, this study, this closet, was a combination of a minimum room and or library, perhaps both. And again, we know from documentary sources, for example, Woollerton Hall in Nottinghamshire, but it was not uncommon in the late 17th century for family papers and muniments to be kept together in one place with the printed books of the family library. Let's go back to Laycock, though. If you believe the 1575 Laycock inventory, which has been published, I should add I don't believe it, you would conclude that this had no books in it. This is a house with no books. This is all very fine and dandy, until you actually go to the shelves and you find an appreciable number of books sitting there which have pretty clearly got 16th century English provenance and which, while one can't in every case prove it beyond doubt, in many cases one can prove that these books are Sharrington books from Renaissance Laycock. Here, for example, is a very imperfect now Strasbourg book, a botanical manual, nicely coloured. Here is a 1499 edition of Purcell from Venice, which, as you can see, is annotated in a 16th century English hand. If I observe further that we know a good deal about life in Laycock in the 1560s because it is described in the now published memoirs of Lady Grace Mildmay, traditionally said to be the first Englishwoman's autobiography written in a woman's own hand, this starts to fall into place. Grace Mildmay, born Grace Sharrington, describes life at Laycock. She describes her rather exacting Calvinist mother and being taught to pray privately in a closet. She talks too about her relationship with her governess, Mistress Hamblin, and Mistress Hamblin, among other things, shows her books on physic. And finally, if one's thinking about the Plautus, rather racist stuff as I remember, Mother is of the opinion in advising and counselling her children on what to read, that virtue may be found in the works of pagan authors. I think you might look quite a long way, I would have thought, for virtue in the pages of authors, but maybe I'm wrong on that, and others will enlighten me. But notice I said no mention of books in the inventory, and this is a part of a pattern. And I think we're looking at the early history, the prehistory, if you like, of books in country houses. This business of inventories is a really serious problem and something we have to face. You will remember, I am sure many of you, that it is always quoted that Bess of Hardwick and Hardwick Hall own 6 books. Well, I don't really believe that either. I think it's profoundly unlikely. And there are any number of reasons, it seems to me, why books may be missing from the documentary evidence. Those of you who are used to dealing with inventories will recall that in Tudor and Jacobean inventories, one often either finds nothing or you find covered phrases like his books, all her books, and bother to inventory them. Is there a conspiracy going on here, a mutually convenient conspiracy between executors who don't want to enumerate small valuable possessions which can be used to set off debts, and appraisers who don't really understand how to go about listing books, realise that the task is potentially enormously onerous, realise that their own paperwork is largely meaningless anyway, and decide not to bother to do the work in collusion with those commissioning them? Well, that's one possibility. Another possibility, surely, is that, as in later times, that book inventories and other inventories required separate documents, and for a whole range of reasons, book inventories have often failed to survive. I won't provide specific examples of that, but I could do so. One final example comes from Bess's erstwhile prisoner, the Queen of Scots, who at the time of her death apparently owned an appreciable number of books, and in the inventory there is a scribbled note to the effect of, and the said Queen also owned quite a lot of books, but her servants had taken them, they claiming that she had given them to them. So another example there of why things may be missing. Another house where one can think about books. There's a great deal about reading and related activities in the memoirs of Lady Anne Clifford at Knowle and elsewhere, and that surely is worth thinking about. And of course, if one wants to get some sort of visual insight into what might have these rooms have looked like, well, here is the great picture of Lady Anne Clifford. And in the absence of many of the stage sets in which the activities of book ownership and reading out loud, as was done at Knowle, in the absence of those stage sets, I think it's often evidence like this that we have to turn to. We might equally look at things like this, which is the family portrait of Sir Thomas Lucy III of Charlcote. He dies in 1640. First of all, it is an interest that his wife owned the library because the books are mentioned in her funeral sermon, though we know nothing further about them. Then perhaps it seems interesting that Thomas's books, as you can see, are stacked quite unthinkingly behind him, not only with their linen tapes, but with their pages, their foredges, as we would say, pointing in our direction, very much as many of the books on the shelves at Charlcote still have forage titles, and very much as they're shown in this alabaster depiction of Thomas's study on his tomb in Charlcote Church. One can see that he's got slightly up-to-date taste here and there, because that TL livery binding at the top is pretty clearly French work, and I think the assumption from this, that we don't know this for certain, is that this chap has gone on a grand tour, a proto-grand tour, and got at least as far as Paris for a bit of finish, something which is not unknown at the time. Let's go back to Petworth, though, and to the Wizard Earl of Northumberland, here painted by Van Dyck, but of course I'm not interested in that. But we know, again, a good deal about the books of the Wizard Earl of Northumberland, which were listed in his inventory of 1632 in his library at Petworth. It will be well known, I think, to some here, that the books in the library were not on shelves or fittings, but the books are described as being in chests. And that surely is something that we want to think about. That, incidentally, is the Monarchy Globe. So the Wizard Earl, in addition to books in chests, with his armorial stamp on them, has scientific kit. Of course, he's much involved in alchemy and related activities. But why chests? And is it possible to advance some tentative thoughts on this? Well, one answer could be a perfectly conventional way of keeping books. And we know that as recently as the 18th century, a house in North Wales was reported as having ancient books in a hamper, which sounds very medieval to me and really rather intriguing. Another way of looking at the Wizard Earl is perhaps looking at a way of comparison inventories like those which the societal response at the inventories of Henry VIII, where some of us, I hope, will remember that in addition to having static libraries in the principal palaces, there's also something that looks distinctly like a mobile library which is kept in 23 coffers, not just books but other precious objects, which are stored in the wardrobe in the tower, but which are presumably available to be shunted around. Is this significant for the Wizard Earl? Well, bearing in mind the number of houses that the Purcells owned, which included, among other things, their northern residences, Northumberland House in London, Petworth, and Zion, where there was certainly a library in the 16th century, that seems to me to be not impossible. Another example, very cutting edge, I was having a very interesting conversation with a researcher on Monday on the telephone, and we were discussing the case of Edward Lord Herbert of Cherbury, who owned what was perhaps the greatest private library in early modern Wales. A bit difficult to pin down. Many of the books have been scattered. Some are at Jesus College, Oxford. A rump of a rump remains in private hands in Paris Castle, of books that were in Montgomery Castle and in London in the reign of Charles I. But the paperwork associated with this might be susceptible to suggesting that the books of Edward Lord Herbert of Cherbury were kept not on bookshelves, but on chests. Otherwise, how does one explain why it is that shelves in London are lettered C and then H to the rest of the alphabet? Does this perhaps imply not shelves, but mobile storage, chests, which can be shuffled around? I don't know. We need to think about this, and maybe we won't find out. Let's move on a bit further into the 17th century, though, to Roger Pratt's Kingston Lacy of 1663, of course spectacularly rebuilt by Barry, where there is also a library which contains books which may well have been here in Corfe Castle before it was blown up in 1646. There too is, of course, evidence of libraries in castles. I think we rather easily think of country houses being one sort of animal and ruined castles being another. But actually there is some evidence of a library in Raglan Castle before the Civil War. I suspect if one looked hard enough, would one find evidence of books at Wardour? Quite possibly. Would one find evidence of books at Kenilworth? Yes, certainly. They are recorded in published transcripts from the 19th century. So there's a big subject to look at there. Now, among the books which could have been in Corfe Castle and are now Kingston Lacy is this fantastic binding by the Huguenot émigré Jean de Planche, not made for the Bankses of Kingston Lacy. They, of course, have jumped up nobodies who make it in the law in the reign of Charles I, but made for Sir Nicholas Bacon, Lord Keeper Bacon, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Now, whether this is a piece of gift-giving or a piece of extreme conspicuous expenditure, we must decide for ourselves. And whether it was kept in London or at Bacon's house at Gorhambury in Hertfordshire, again, I can't tell you, but you only have to go to the British Galleries in the V&A, or still better, to go shuffling around the Clements collection of armorial book bindings in the V&A to see that luxury book bindings belonging to very grand Tudor grandees are not particularly difficult to find. So much for no books in houses. That's something that we need to think about more as well. But let's stick to Kingston Lacy in the 1640s, where the great bulk of the early books there, and there are a considerable number of them, actually belong to two young men, two teenagers in fact, Ralph and John Banks, who are Charles I Attorney General's sons, and they are packed off on what you might call a grand tour, or you might perhaps, if you're American, call draft dodging in the 1640s to keep them out of the way. And you can track their progress around the continent through their book acquisitions on the shelves, books bought in Padua, in Rouen, in Paris, with dates and so on. And also, rather curiously, something which I've seen elsewhere now and again, of the purchaser writing their name in the books in the language of the country in which they are in, hence Giovanni Banks rather than John Banks. Anyway, there is young man Banks with his tutor. The tutor clearly did a good job, because clearly one of the major sources for the history of reading in country houses is the commonplace book. And I won't gloss this too much or explain to this audience what a commonplace book is, but clearly as evidence of who is reading what. If you can find these things, they are gold. Kingston Lacy is also interesting, very interesting, because it points up and reminds us of the importance in terms of book culture of connections with the continent. It's particularly rich in rather grand, rather up-to-date, rather up-to-the-minute French books. Why, for example, are there 3 of these 17th century pop-up anatomy manuals? I don't know. Why were these teenage boys interested in this question? Again, something to be thought about. But let's move on, otherwise we'll get stranded in the 17th century and we need to move forward. This, of course, is Ham House, which is one of the most famous English library interiors. I think, if anything, and I dare say that despite the wonderful work that's going on recently with at least two fellows of the Society, David Adshead and Giles Mandelbrot, who have written respectively on the architecture of this room and on the lost bibliotheca Nandiana, coming out in April. I have a slight feeling that this important library room gets rather too much attention because it tends to be taken as the beginning of the story rather than somewhere in the middle. And of course, we've also got the very important point that the Duke of Lauderdale's books are not there anymore because they were sold by the Duchess in the 1690s, a big subject which Giles Mandelbrot discusses very ably and which I commend to you. But clearly by the end of the 17th century, we've got the world of the closet is growing and growing and growing. Is this a library closet? Well, traditionally it's called the study at Belton, but it has about 8,500 books in it, so no small thing. Note the busts. Presumably the owner was familiar both with Vitruvius's advocacy of busts in libraries, but also with the Caesars in the Cottonian Library in Westminster. And of course, in addition to that sort of library kit, there are those out there who will provide you with other forms of useful paraphernalia. I particularly like providing with all sorts of books from Turkey, something that caused great consternation to a student intern with me a few years ago. How on earth did one get that many turkeys together in one place? I had to re-explain that a little. But note the fact that Mr. Brotherson will find your books in situ, and will finish your books in situ. So perhaps that's testament to the great turnaround, the fashion for flipping books around that had previously been forage outwards and wanting to show them with their spines outwards, and therefore wanting the plain spines to be decorated. And of course, books in great houses can be stored in cupboards, as with William Blathwaite's library at Durham Park in Gloucestershire, clearly resembling books in the Pepysian Library of Cambridge. Equally, they can be in handsome rooms. This is Dunham Massey in Cheshire, and this is the library, an extraordinarily useful but really rather archaic room for whenever it was put up for the Second Earl of Warrington in the 1720s or 1730s. This room, according to an appraiser, contained a great number of useful books. The appraiser didn't want to say what they were, but that's also interesting, isn't it? Books as utilitarian objects, not as collectibles. So the Lauderdale Library, for example, clearly there is an idea of books as connoisseur items, as collectibles, as things that exist in a historical continuum. The Warrington Library certainly has smart things in it, and I think you see the signs of the instruments in a different light when you see this from the Great Blau Atlas in 11 volumes in folio, gilded. But more to the point, I think, the value of libraries like Dunham, and there are plenty others of this around, is as places to investigate the history of the ordinary. So in this case, pamphlets about the growing of pineapples in dung pits. I could equally have shown you the one about the false teeth manufacturing. And of course, another important point which comes out of Dunham and in many, many other houses is the role of women. I get thoroughly tired of hearing pontificating from cultural theorists, both of our own era and of the 18th and 17th century, about gender roles and perceptions of what should be and how things are. Unfortunately, very few people seem to have told 17th and 18th century men and women what roles they were supposed to be performing, because you find women's books all over the place in great confusion. And then also the theme of Dunham Massey, which is worth thinking about, is the business of who runs the library. We all know, if we've ever had responsibility for books, that they don't just look after themselves. It's a lot of labour. At Dunham, the answer is the memorably named Reverend Mr. Smith, who compiled 2 library catalogues, one for Dunham Massey and one for the family's other house at Endford in Staffordshire. He was a minor canon at Worcester Cathedral, good means of earning an income for a jobbing clergyman. But I think you can see the developments of the catalogue here in the scribblings, that library catalogues are not static. And if you look at library catalogues, again and again, you find evidence of active management over many decades. Let's flip now to something much grander, to Blickling, famously the home of one of the great historic private libraries. But an important observation here, of course, is that Blickling and many other very, very grand connoisseur libraries were not necessarily assembled in the country. This collection was assembled by the Lincolnshire Baronet's Richard Ellis of Nocton, who spent most of his time not on his estates outside Lincoln, but either at his villa in Ealing or in his townhouse about 150 yards down the road from here in Bolton Street, which is where his librarian was usually resident. The librarian, Scott John Mitchell, familiar to some here, and an exemplar figure who was becoming quite common in grand houses by this era, he's a very active and industrious man, with all this scribbling in one of the huge collection of annotated sales catalogues. And he and Ellis together assembled really remarkable things. Two great Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, both last sold in 1931, although the export bars had come a bit earlier, it never happened. And of course, in this place, we need no reminders of the interconnections between book collecting and antiquarian studies, as in this verse chronicle of Peter Langtoft. But Ellis is also very much a connoisseur of fine printing and of books and of the intellectual connections between the national class, Protestantism, and the art of printing. So here is Dure's Unterweisung on the use of harmonic proportion in the design of typefaces from 1524, one of many, many hundreds of comparable books of similar date and grandeur. He's also mentioned things like this, Judaism. Now, of course, in addition to having a librarian, there are others who can help you. The publisher Bernard Lintott, for example, produces these, they're sort of chop-up things, and you razor them out. These are shelf labels for putting on the spine of your books. For whatever reason, this single example from the 1730s survives unused in the papers of the Finch family in the Leicestershire Record Office. So that too is worth thinking about in terms of activity. And of course, it houses, we don't want to be too ducal. England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland, the three kingdoms and the dependency of the occupied dependency of Wales, you might say. There are umpteen gentry houses. This is Spring Hill in County Londonderry, for example, where, as in the grander places, a mix of the scholarly and annotated first edition of Leviathan. What is the point, some people ask me now and again, of the National Trust having 8 copies of Hobbes' Leviathan in the first edition? And the answer is that everyone has their own history, and most of them are annotated, and this one is totally annotated by a young man educated at library in the 1680s. But of course you can find books annotated of another kind. Country House libraries are rich resources for those interested in history of schooling, 1675 Aesop. If we want to look at the mundane and the ordinary, another good place here is Cork Abbey. We are shortly to publish a downloadable PDF guide for this library. I hope you enjoy it. Meantime, you might like to see the carriage manual and a book on rat catching. Both of these, incidentally, now exceedingly rare. Learned libraries didn't collect books on rat catching in the 18th century. Also thinking about the mundane, and a library which I'm very fond of, this is Airlig in North Wales, a room fitted up in the 1770s, but using books which had previously been in the closet from the 1720s or 30s. And again, a relentless parade of the mundane. It's one of the odder facts about the study of country house libraries that they've been looked at at all. The focus in the past has been relentlessly on incubables and finely illuminated things, rather than, for example, books on obstetrics, whist, or brewing. Incidentally, every man her own brewer, New York, is not a man, her name is Dorothy, an interesting observation. And then, of course, we have books for servants. I don't kid myself that Mrs. Ebrel, the spider brusher at Airlig, would have used books, but certainly other servants did, among them Mrs. Radcliffe, the lady's maid. There are similar borrowers' registers to that of Airlig, waiting to be examined in greater detail at, for example, Belton, and on an even grander scale at Grosvenor Castle in Scotland. Borrowers' registers seem to be extremely popular in Scotland, and that's worth thinking about. And then, of course, we've got the emerging idea, which I think is clearly true, but I think tends to be overemphasised, of the social library, the library as the wet day room, the library for sociable reading or playing chess or group reading. This is Saltram in Devon, which is sort of semi-Adam library. I won't gloss that too much. Where again we have a mix of the everyday and now unique, as far as I know, guidebook to the Salcombe Estuary, along with some rather quirky bits of antiquarian collecting. So this book from Poitiers from 1564 is, as far as I can see, the only copy of this book in the United Kingdom. It's rather splendid, I think. And of course, if you have a great social library, then you may need forms of kit to use in it, like metamorphic library chairs, or indeed, whodunit, scientific instruments. Scientific instruments enjoyed a terrible rate of survival. One only has to look at inventories to see how many globes were presumably smashed to pieces by children or careless servants or dropped down the stairs. But if we're thinking about reading, we could move to the truly sublime, what do I mean the ridiculous, in the form of summer libraries. This is the summer library of the Earl Bishop of Derry, Mussington Temple. Yes, this room really was furnished up with books as an adjunct to the books in the main family library. If that seems altogether too bonkers, Hawksmoor proposed a reading turret in the Castle Howard estate in the 1720s, and also in Ireland in the 1770s, this temple was pronounced to be sweetly calculated for reading and meditation. So, of course, reading may be something that you wish to do in private and in solitude. And again, there is much evidence of reading on country house shelves. A volume of sermons from Cork Abbey, or indeed a rather stroppy note from Clanton Park in Surrey. And if you look carefully, you find quite a number of these knocking around. It seems to me, as a practicing librarian, you don't put notes up telling people to put the books back in the right place if nobody's touching the books from one year to the next. But of course, one can always think about books in terms of utility for the wider estate. So Florence Court in Ireland, for example, has books on agriculture and improvement, in this case, how to move trees around your park. If you want to be altogether grander, of course, you have a twin point of inspiration. You can go to the Gothic, and of course, Sloane's Gothic Library at Stowe was designed to house a great collection of Anglo-Saxon and Irish manuscripts, but you may go Roman, as at Kedleston, very splendid Adam Library. You tell it's been designed by an architect. There's nowhere near enough room for books. And of course, within such libraries, the classical inheritance, I don't need to gloss too much, but we'll have a few bits and pieces. This, for example, is the 1495 Aubertine Aristotle at Charlcote. These are a pair of very nice French Renaissance books bought by a pair of brothers at Church Castle in the 1740s. And of course, this leads us quite nicely into the topic of Regency Bibliomania. This is Tatton Park. Bibliomania on a relatively modest scale, and in obvious emulation of the owner's brother-in-law, Mark Masterman Sykes of Sledmere. But I could equally well mention people like the Duke of Roxburgh, whose library was sold in 1812, or Second Earl Spencer, whose library survives in Manchester today, or Marcus of Blandford at White Knights on the outskirts of what's now Reading. And of course, why is this possible? I don't need to gloss this too much. Of course, there's a huge glut of seriously old books knocking around all over Europe in the period after the French Revolution. And this stokes the fashion, along with emerging ideas of romanticism and an interest in the past. But sometimes it can go disastrously wrong. The Marquis of Blandford went bust, and his library was sold. So too, in a rather different way, to the second Lord Berwick at Attingham in Shropshire, who built this detached library pavilion and went under, resulting in a series of bankruptcy sales. But also in the Regency, you've got ordinary books, not necessarily particularly ordinary interiors. Thomas Hopper's library at Penryn, which leads us to the question, of course, is that one always has to remember, to be a realistic historian, what's paying for all this stuff. Industry or slaves, or of course landowning. Also thinking about the social library, it's worth remembering the extent to which these supposed lounging libraries are often filled with books inherited from previous generations, like Scotney Castle. It's also worth remembering that one generation's perception of what a room is for may develop over time, as Mrs. Betty Hussey's bonnet at Scotney Castle shows. I didn't know Betty Hussey very well, but somehow I didn't imagine that she was consulting the early 17th century books very often. But of course, in that library also, local printing, useful books here on pop culture, but lots of other useful things. Another 19th century theme is about the rediscovery of antique libraries. So antique books, early English books found at Lamport in Northamptonshire in 1867, or the rediscovery of the library at Hydrock by the Bodleians W.H. Allnutt in the 1870s and 1880s, where he found marvellous things, many of them which belonged to the splendidly named Hannibal Gammon, the local vicar and a former lecturer at Oxford. Tudor wallpaper, for example, embedded in bindings, or the only known copy of the earliest English ABC of about 1535. But also with 19th century librarians, I give you Mr. Worcester of Wallington with a droopy moustache in the background, surely the only private librarian ever immortalised in a pre-Raphaelite cycle of wall paintings. Or, if you prefer, another librarian, Dr. John Bacon Medley, the Anglo-Catholic celibate chaplain, resident chaplain at Tinsfield, a chapel the size of the Cambridge College Chapel to play in, and a library like the college library, all arranged by subject, with a printed catalogue, a subject arrangement, and the borrower's register. There's an awful lot of stuff going on, this kind of stuff going on in Victorian houses. Of course, we've also got book collecting by the super rich. So one of 800 wonderful French bindings recently catalogued, about to be published, a marvellous catalogue by the late and much lamented Giles Barber, his last, I hope, great monument to scholarship. But equally, other people other than the Rothschilds collecting equally at this kind of elevated level in other areas. And then, of course, you've got another source of nouveau riche in the form of people like Lord Armstrong at Cragside. And if you went to a house party there, well, no doubt they would have tried to sell you a battleship. The books look like ordinary Victorian books, and so they are. But sources show beyond any doubt that people who went here, that these books were a resource for people passing through. And should you have had difficulty in reading in the Northumbrian gloom on a wet day, Lord Armstrong helped me install the first electric lights in Europe used internally to help you. Of course, the other great story of the last 100-odd years is decline and fall. The Settled Lands Acts of 1882, I hope, need no glossing. They allow you to break entails and chattels, and that leads to a huge cycle of sales, which to some extent still continues. This is the library, or the library room about from the Fellows Switch Colt Hall at Stourhead. It has books on it, but they're not his. These are the books from the second family home at Wavendon, brought in after the Colt Hall collection was sold in 1885. But equally, you could look at the Glen sale, the Hamilton Palace sale, the Clarendon sale. I could go on. There's a great crop of them in the 1880s. And sales continue. Sometimes whole libraries, sometimes here, as it happens actually in Northamptonshire, individual books. Shakespeare First Folio sold 1913. Now, if you want a picture of the country house in decline, this is a good iconic one, isn't it? Matty Shingwell's open cast mining at Wentworth Woodhouse. I think if you want a library, you might almost go to this. And I wonder if one National Trust visitor in 1,000 going to Sudbury Hall realised that this long gallery was shelved floor to ceiling in the 19th century with a great collection of mostly Italian Renaissance books. Of course, in the 20th century, we've also got the beginnings of the cult of the country house. So here's Vita Sackville West and her long library at Sissinghurst. One or two arts and crafts and treasures, which of course one would expect to find in a library of this era. But much more too, this is a library about reading and thinking, with a whole literary archive sitting inside books in the form of review copies. And of course, writers, authors who do very well for themselves and set up in a big house in the country, or maybe studying their libraries is no more anomalous than studying the library of Edwardian biscuit manufacturers. It's external money coming in to fund a grand lifestyle. Of course, in many libraries of all periods, one can find annotations in books, and these can be very illuminating and revealing. For those of you who haven't read that yet, you'll have to come back to it later. And of course, the Millionaires Library continues. The Library of the Earl of Perth in Scotland was first not that long ago. Of course, another sort of library of extreme grandeur, the library at Wormsley, which was that is not a great country house library, or my NT example, the Library of Huddleston Broughton, First Lord Fairhaven at Battersea Abbey, particular favourite for those like me entirely seeing 17th century gentlemen's books, and you just want a bit of sheer blood-minded billionaire bling. Here is the Great Library by Sidney Parvin, the in-house architect of the Mayfair interior design firm, with its infinity mirrors, described by a colleague of mine as somewhat resembling the Batcave, which seemed to me to be about right. The money, of course, as often with grand houses in the 20th century, doesn't come from land and estates. It comes, in this case, from mother, who was one of the Standard Oil Corporation heiresses. No shortage of lolly here. And, of course, then this provided the opportunity to buy wonderful things. Not the kind of wonderful things I think I necessarily bought, but nonetheless wonderful for all that, like fine book bindings, and particularly absolutely wonderful colour plate books in many hundreds of copies. And, of course, we're talking about high-polluting stuff. But, of course, one has to remember that country houses still continue, people still live in them, and they still buy modern books to put in them. I have at least one house in my care which has a set of Mr. Men book in them. If you prefer, you can go to the Snowy Day, which is from Tinsfield, or if you really prefer, you can go for this presentation copy from Mrs. Thatcher, which again is a Scotland. I really want to end with half a dozen very short musings, which are really as follows. These are points for thought or debate when thinking about country houses and their libraries, a subject which I'm doing quite a lot of at the moment. The first is, it seems to me that the history tends to be starting much too late, and there is clearly an awful lot that we still need to learn about libraries in grand private houses before, let us say, about 1660 and 1680. There has been work done in this area. There is more that could be done, and I think we can learn further insights by simply looking at some of the work done by medieval manuscript scholars over the centuries, where it's clear that there are large numbers of books knocking around with English and Scottish and Welsh and Irish aristocratic provenances, which perhaps looked at in a slightly different way might reveal some interesting answers. My second one is, and I'm aware here that I published an article a number of years ago challenging the idea that there was any such thing as a country house library, but I think I can refine that now and just observe the enormous diversity of form and function, and ask, therefore, how do we create a sort of intellectual structure that allows us to understand these collections without falling into terribly simplistic assumptions, like, for example, the assumption that because a room is designed as a sitting room for a family, that nobody uses the books, they're clearly just for show, for example. Another thought is, if you like, what you might call the diaspora. How many people are aware and consciously think of the fact that benediction of St Athelwold was at Chatsworth for 270 years before it came to London? And that clearly is something that could be replicated literally a million times over. And that's a point which I think is worth thinking about. And then finally, and I leave you with this rather amusing picture from the Fairhaven collection, it seems to me, having been extraordinarily privileged to go poking around in about 150 libraries in great detail over the last 10, 15 years, that the evidence of books and libraries themselves often suggest a huge variety of life and activity going on within them, often life and activity which you don't pick up from the documentary sources, but only looking at the books themselves, their annotations, their marks, their binding, their shelf numbers, any number of other things. And it seems to me that we have a rather one-dimensional picture of what these libraries are for. There's been such heavy emphasis on books as consumption and conspicuous expenditure that other themes, reading, sociability, scholarship, information, if you like, or cultural exchange, tends to get rather overlooked. And I think related to that, and my final gambit, is that there clearly is much more of a shading between public and private than we tend to assume. It's clear that many of these libraries are accessible to large numbers of people. It is equally clear that many libraries which we are accustomed to think of today as being public collections were in no sense public in times past. These are just musings, but I think even if any of those four musings are even partially right, there are some quite big issues at work, and I would be interested, I think, in the opinions of fellows of this either today or even some future opportunities to discuss them. Thank you.